I think the Shire feels like a kind of ideal home for a lot of readers, a home that they certainly don't have in so-called reality, but that they feel at home in and would like to have. Um, and of course, Tolkien's been accused many times of escapism and nostalgia for encouraging this sort of thing. Uh, I feel those charges are quite unfair. Um, the kind of nostalgia that's in Tolkien's books can be a very empowering one. It can help readers value and perhaps even fight for aspects of local knowledge, local importance, local nature that actually need protecting these days. And in that sense, it's what I've called, after another writer, Fraser Harrison, radical nostalgia. And similarly, Tolkien's escapism, I think quite an overblown charge, although a very common one. Um, uh, Tolkien was aware of it himself, of course, and uh, he said, "Well, um, if someone is a prisoner, experiences themselves as a prisoner in the modern world, why should they not dream or think of things outside the prison? And why should they not try and escape if they get the chance?" Uh, he then went on to say, actually, what I'm accused of is not so much the flight of a prisoner trying to escape, hence escapism. It's the flight of the deserter. He said, I haven't signed up. He didn't say this literally, but in effect, I haven't signed up to the modern vision, so I'm accused of treason. And his readers, who enjoy his books, are accused of sort of letting this modern side down somehow. This says a great deal more about the critics than it does about Tolkien's readers. Well, is the Shire England? Yes and no is the only possible answer. Because I think it's important to make a distinction between what Tolkien intended and what he put into The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and what readers find there, what they get out of it. The Shire corresponds to the English self-image, cultural self-image, of these small, cozy, slightly parochial and limited, but comforting sort of settings. That's how the English have long liked to see themselves, which of course completely flies in the face of the fact that England was England was the country that industrialized before anybody else, and to a greater extent than anybody else, and urbanized. So critics literary critics, for example, have seized on this and said, well, look, all this cozy ruralism is a mere illusion and nostalgia, but that's to miss the point. How people see themselves and want to see themselves is very important, whether it's rooted in so-called reality or not. It has its own reality. It has its own effects, and so Tolkien keyed into that cultural fact very closely. There's a kind of limited universality in Tolkien's world, particularly respecting the Shire, that I think is the result of the English language and English literature and the way it has diffused through the world and its cultural dominance everywhere that English is spoken. And that literature has communicated the kind of cultural self-understanding of a rural people, which of course sits very strangely with the English imperial past, but nonetheless it's there as a self-image. And so everywhere that literature has gone, it would make it easier to access the Shire, as it were. But it's very important to remember that the Shire is only one part, and a relatively small part, of Middle Earth. And Middle Earth as a whole has enormous geographical and cultural variety. Um, it's middle partly because it's between, the hot south and the deserts and the icy north. Um, And so there's actually probably nowhere in the world that doesn't resemble, at least to some extent, somewhere in Middle-earth. So in that sense, that's another kind of universality. There's somewhere, and a corresponding, there's a natural locale in Middle-earth and a corresponding culture, because that's the way it works in Middle-earth, that almost anyone can identify with or understand to some extent. So by presenting them readers with this picture of the Shire, which translates globally into other cultural equivalents of the Shire, um, uh, Tolkien is reconnecting readers with what they feel in danger of losing in their lives in the modern world. And I think that's one of the reasons for his success. He touches on things that people value, even if they don't articulate it particularly clearly, and that they feel that they're losing. When I was trying to understand The Lord of the Rings, not so much from the point of view of what Tolkien put into it, but from what readers get out of it, um, I came to think that there were sort of three concerns, three domains in this book. Um, One was the Shire and the hobbits. But the Shire is enclosed by Middle-earth as a whole. And of course, one of the striking things about The Lord of the Rings is that Middle-earth seems to be alive and an entity in its own right. And the different parts of it are alive, the forests, the mountains, and so on. So it seemed to me that the Shire and the sort of cultural and political, with a small p, world of the hobbits was enclosed by something greater, and that's the natural and ecological world of Middle-earth. But Middle-earth, too, is only part of the picture, and what surrounds Middle-earth, what limits it? It's the sea. And for Tolkien, the sea, I think, symbolizes the ultimate mystery of life, which is spiritual. And if you put these three kind of nested concerns together, you have the cultural enclosed by the natural or ecological, enclosed by the spiritual. And those are the three principal values that Tolkien was, I think, trying to defend. And they are three concerns that many, I think most of his readers share. It's certain cultural values that they feel are threatened. The natural world is obviously severely under threat. And of course, in spiritual values, in a certain sense, although religion is alive and well, spiritual values not necessarily quite the same thing. And they can be seen as in jeopardy in many ways as well. So I think the love of those things and the fear for them that Tolkien put into his books is also what readers get out of them, what they perceive in their own ways. They'll bring their own experience to understanding that and fleshing it out. Middle-earth is clearly the northwest of the old world, that is to say, the part of Europe, northwest part of Europe. And I think the setting of the films is interesting in this regard, being, of course, New Zealand. It looks right to me, but it doesn't feel right. Comparing the films with the books and knowing the books well, perhaps too well in a sense, the visual aspects of the film are the settings. They're all they're very dramatic, and they seem to be entirely appropriate. But somehow the feeling of an old world, which is very, very important, I think, to Tolkien's Middle-earth, for me is missing from the New Zealand settings. Now, it may be that geographically New Zealand is just as old as Europe, but I think what's missing is a sort of relatively unbroken continuity, cultural continuity. I mean, it's obviously broken up by invasions and migrations and so on, but there's a cultural continuity about Europe, which Tolkien very much draws on, and gives it a certain sense of depth that, well, I personally just can't access in an Antipodean setting, I'm afraid. When you enter the world of The Lord of the Rings, especially, but also The Hobbit, um, you're coming into a world that already has a very long history, and many things have already happened there, and you're entering midstream, as it were, which is one of the things that gives it the extraordinary sort of depth and partly explains the sense of reality, I think, that readers have of these places, that these are real places. The situation with the Silmarillion is very different, because there Tolkien was trying to lay out the actual background, the primordial events from sort of mythological time. And ironically, therefore, the Silmarillion doesn't have any sense of depth, because there isn't anything before that. Nothing has gone before. So it's, in that sense, much less real, harder to relate to, and certainly much harder going. So I don't think it's surprising that The Lord of the Rings is his most popular work, and it will certainly remain that way. The other thing that's very markedly different about The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit on one hand and the Silmarillion on the other is, of course, the Hobbits. And the Hobbits provide a way for many readers, most readers probably, to identify with someone in this story. They're a point of entry for a contemporary person who does not feel himself or herself to be terribly, terribly important in the big scheme of things. Who's ultimately a little person who would like to get on with their life and not be too threatened and not be eaten by wolves and so on. The Hobbits are actually an interesting mixture of archaic and contemporary and modern. They're quite bourgeois, of course, in many ways. So that when the giant eagle, for example, asks Bilbo rhetorically what could be finer than flying, Bilbo wants to reply, a nice hot bath and breakfast on the lawn afterwards. But of course he doesn't dare actually say that, but that's what he thinks. And that sort of attitude is very easy for us to understand. And it's a big help when the rest of the cast is so potentially overwhelming and archaic and strange. So the Hobbits are very important in that way, and their absence from the Silmarillion makes an enormous difference. Myth is very important in Tolkien, and some readers and more critics, I think, have made this sharp distinction between myth and reality in Tolkien's work. And so they would, for example, find certain places in the books, relate them to certain real places, and that kind of approach. But I think it's possible to make a fundamental error in doing that, which is to assume that what we call real places or physical places aren't mythical. As a matter of fact, if you take myth in the broadest sense, which is sort of metaphors that have acquired particular cultural resonance, very, very few places, in fact I would say probably none, that we know of, that have any meaning to us, are not mythical in that sense. Every place has an attached set of meanings and metaphors. So, in that sense, of course, Tolkien's places are mythical, because our places are mythical. And it's an illusion to think that you could actually have a place that means anything to anyone that wasn't, in that sense, mythical.